Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Political Pulse podcast. I am your host, Ryan Painter, and I am really excited to have Mark Milke from the Aristotle Foundation join me for a discussion about the Aristotle Foundation and his latest book, which I have a copy of here, The Victim Cult. I even was lucky enough to get a signed copy. Look at that. Wonderful. Mark, thank you so much for joining me.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Mark, before we dive into the book, what is the Aristotle Foundation? Can you give my listeners, my viewers, a bit of a background?
Sure. Well, we started 4 years ago in the background, 2 years ago publicly in June 2023, released our first book called The 1867 Project. But basically, I've been thinking for some time, like, I think there's been a lot of attacks on what's broadly called Western civilization. Um, And everything from the last 2,000 years of history to the Enlightenment to the history in Canada, the attacks on John A. Macdonald, the statues coming down, the attack on empiricism from the Enlightenment, for example, your truth, my truth. So I thought, look, I think we need to have a think tank that addresses some of these issues, goes beyond just the data, for example, and statistics, which we use at Aristotle to make some points, but also brings in history, right? The value of history. If people are attacking history or, attacking your civilization, so to speak, it's like attacking the roots of an oak tree, right? The reason the oak tree can shelter a lot of people under it, in a summer storm, is because it's got deep roots and lots of branches. But I mean, country, at least one worth having, or a civilization worth having, is the same thing. If you attack the branch or you attack the roots of a tree because you see like a flawed branch, so okay, we didn't have the vote for Indigenous Canadians before 1960 or women before 1920. That's like a flawed branch on a tree. You don't take down the entire tree. You prune the branch, you reform it. You give women the vote in, whatever it was, 1918. You give Indigenous Canadians the vote in 1960. And I would argue Canada and much of the Western world, not entirely, I prefer the British Empire to the Spanish and Portuguese Empire, but Canada and the classical liberal ideas of the 19th century and how we got to where we are today is a result of good ideas in the 19th century. John Stuart Mill on freedoms, Mary Wollstonecraft on the rights of women, the notion of the individual, which developed from a Christian understanding that, you don't have to be Christian to accept it, but it developed from the understanding that the individual has worth. And that has roots in certain Western traditions. Now, these days, anyone can hold those and promote them because they see them as self-evident or want to believe it's a good idea to have them. So you can be in Hong Kong, as I was in 2013, and talk with people who have no Western tradition other than the British colonial era or other nations like South Korea, and they think the individual is worth something. And that, markets are the way to go as opposed to, command and control economies of the 20th century until 1989 are coming back now in some cases. Long explanation, but basically I thought the successes of the free and flourishing societies that have been created in the post-war world, and in fact, for the last 2 centuries, and which have roots that go back farther than that, were being attacked, and a lot of the rot is in universities. And so I just thought, we live in an anti-reality age, an anti-reason age, an anti-responsibility age. Our logo or our motto at the Aristotle Foundation is we want to champion reason, democracy, and civilization. It's not reasonable to call Canada genocidal in its treatment of Native peoples. That's simply a false accusation. And it mixes up and it muddies the water when you have true genocides around the world. We have a democracy in Canada, I think, could use some improvement. I like referendums, for example, because I think they allow citizens to have input in the system. Civilizational attacks. What does a decline in civilization in Canada look like? Well, last weekend, there was an article in the National Post about violence in hospitals, right? Attacks on doctors and nurses. I remember an article a couple of years ago from Cranbrook talking about violence, gangs coming into a hospital to fight it out. Like, that's not the Canada you and I grew up with. That's kind of an indication of a decline of civilization. Where certainly, if you look worldwide, what's an example of, a civilizational decline or attack on a civilization? October the 7th, right? You've got people who don't like the liberal democracy that is Israel, which has Arabs and Muslims and Jews and Christians and atheists, and, gay and straight and so on and so forth. You've got people that cross the border, and I've been at that border, and really tried to start a second Holocaust on October 7th, 2023. That's anti-civilization. So, I mean, I could go on and on with examples, but we were set up really to look at Canada and say, listen, I think we've got some problems here. We better think about what kind of Canada we want. And in our case, at Aristotle, the board, the staff, and I set up this foundation to really say, look, we want to look at each other as individuals. We want to create a freer and flourishing society or renew that again. And actually, we want to cherish the past, build on the past sacrifices, right? Because it's not okay to say to your parents, mine, or our grandparents, well, you didn't hold exactly the views we do today. That must mean we cancel you. It's absurd, right? So we wanted to address some of these issues of, attacks on Canadian history and just some of the anti-reality thinking out there. That's a long answer to a short question, but I'd say that's what we're about: attacking anti-reality thinking today and pointing to a better policy or idea set, and also just trying to get people to think a little more nuanced about Canadian history.
I love the idea of kind of coming at this from a what is reality perspective, because so for me, I mean, the majority of my adult life and most of my teens, I was on, what you would classically call the left, and agitated in that way and was an activist and all kinds of stuff. And then I, right near the end of my 30s, I had a bit of a it's kind of a social cultural political awakening. And a lot of it happened because there's lots of reasons for it. The left has a deep-rooted anti-Semitism problem that it has refused to adjust to, or to even try to root out, despite, efforts of a great many people, not least of which included myself. But the other thing was the inability to actually discuss things like off-topic conversations. For example, for me, for years, I advocated nuclear energy because I'm very much in favor of renewing and activating nuclear energy generation. While on the left, you can't talk about that. Like, you just can't talk about it because everyone talks about, oh, bombs and, Fukushima. And it's just like, no, like, there's rational scientific conversations you can have around these topics. You talk about enlightenment. Well, that's what the Enlightenment period was about, was having conversations backed by science and reason and logic. Now, my curiosity, and we'll get to the book in a bit, but my curiosity is in pushing back against some of this reality or non-reality thinking. You do run into challenges and issues, I suppose, where people would say, well, look, whose reality are we basing this on? Are we basing this on a reality of a person who grows up in a certain lifestyle, certain way? Maybe it's a more well-to-do middle class lifestyle. Well, their reality may necessarily be different than someone who's growing up on a reserve, for example. It's just the example that pops into my head. So how do you approach that conversation? And I couch it in those terms because, we kind of open this talking about, the vote in Indigenous communities and, Canada not being genocidal, but can you not be a genocidal country but still commit genocide? And because I think certainly the argument has been that what happened with residential schools, which only really kind of ended in 1996, has been classified as a genocide.
Well, according to
Yeah,
one view from the Residential Schools Commission,
yeah.
and I think
Well, at least I'm kind of
like
I'll leave that.
a lead cultural genocide. Yeah. Let me answer your first question because I think it's important. Whose reality? Well, for one thing, this actually points to the Aristotle Foundation, and I think the need for it. Right? I don't believe in your reality, my reality, at least in a lot of areas. I think there's gravity matters, and it doesn't matter what my reality is. If I think I can fly, I'll find out differently once I jump off a 5-story building. So reality does matter. Now, not everything is as simple as that or clear as that. But I think the very notion that sort of everything is structural, which just kind of comes from this, Marxist view, really, or certainly, in the cultural sphere now, like it was in the economic sphere in the last century, this notion that everything is structural, everything's from the top down. In essence, they're saying there's no hard reality or objective reality outside of oneself. I would argue there is, and that's the Enlightenment kind of thinking. And we set up the Aristotle Foundation, and I named it after Aristotle precisely because people ask me why Aristotle. In essence, because he was the first empiricist, or at least in the Western tradition, at least, And so he wrote books about politics, about friendship. You know, um, there's a famous dialogue, of course, in Plato's Republic as well, between the philosophers. And, Plato's taking the position, that, you can create these communist utopias. And, Socrates is arguing back, is it Socrates, that no, you can't. And here's why. And certainly Aristotle, makes this point, observing that observation matters and empiricism matters. So how do you deal with, for example, and a good example is in fact Indigenous issues, Native issues, which I've done some work on for 25, 30 years, and is actually one of the spurs for the book. And Thomas Sowell talks about this in American context with Black Americans. Um, Let me give you another reason why we started the Aristotle Foundation, or insight into it. In 2020, around the time Black Lives Matter erupted, right after the murder of George Floyd and others, but especially after George Floyd, I got a call from a lady in Toronto, or an email rather, and said, "Do you have anything to combat this notion that Black Lives Matter is pushing in Toronto and elsewhere?" Basically blaming everything on racism, all economic outcomes on racism. And she was a part of a parent council at some school that her child went to. And I said, "I don't. I can send you to Thomas Sowell. I showed her my 2019 edition of the Victim Cult, which had just come out, and said, I can throw that in your direction. There's some data in there. But she was basically asking, she suspected that the notion that everything is due to racism, or most things are due to racism in terms of economic outcomes, was faulty. And so at the Aristotle Foundation, in my brain already in 2019, 2020, before it was set up, I wanted to kind of do the Thomas Sowell analysis, have people do that, say, okay, we need to figure out what's causing, for example, poverty among First Nations on average more than other Canadians, right? Because the average incomes of a Native person is lower. But as Thomas Sowell pointed to Black Americans, as Matthew Lau has written for us now in several studies, you better dive into the details, because if you look at the stats can data, you'll find that Native Canadians have an income exactly similar to other Canadians if they have a bachelor's degree, if they're between the ages of 24 and 35. I mean, there's various ways you can cut it, but basically show us the difference, and there is none if you do apple to apple comparisons. Now, why does that matter, and why is the average income lower for Native Canadians vis-a-vis other Canadians? Some simple reasons that the racism explains all explanation don't take into account, doesn't take into account. Geography. A greater proportion of First Nations people in the country live on First Nations, on a reserve in the middle of nowhere, where there's no opportunity, no economic opportunity, no educational opportunity for upgrading. That matters to outcomes. And education matters. The average education level for an Indigenous Canadian is lower than, a Métis Canadian vis-a-vis, someone of Chinese or Taiwanese ancestry. This is why, for example, East Asian Canadians are on the top of the income heap, because they're the most highly educated. So we started the Aristotle Foundation in Canada in part to push back against this narrative and say, basically, everything can be explained by racism in history or now. No, if you're in 1850 and you're a black American, of course, and you're a slave of a Southern plantation owner, a lot can be explained, if not everything, or most things, by racism, by slavery. But in 2025 in Canada, to accuse other Canadians of being racist to the core, institutional racism. I mean, I don't know if you know this, Ryan, but I write about it in some of the work we've done at the Aristotle Foundation and in the Victim Cult. Some of the first laws against discrimination in Canada, institutional discrimination, were enacted in the 1940s and the 1950s. That's when Ontario passed laws against discrimination in lodging based on race and employment based on gender, 1951, 1952, like 13 years ahead of the American Civil Rights Act of 1965. So I say this to say we take an empirical approach at the Aristotle Foundation, because I think that's how it's basically kind of a Socratic question of, okay, you Black Lives Matter, you Abraham X. Kendi, you First Nations, authority, argue that racism explains most, if not everything, in terms of economic outcomes. Okay, well, as Thomas Sowell says, I guess when you go to the fisheries around the world and you find that most in the fisheries historically, the commercial fisheries were Italian, you're saying they must be racist against the Swiss because Italian dominated. Thomas Sowell literally points this out in one example. But of course, there's a more basic explanation. The Swiss don't have coastlines. The Italians do. That explains why they dominate the fishing industry. So I think once you start to question a narrative, I hate that word actually, it's cliche, but once you question these simplistic explanations for outcomes, and you do some analysis, both using data, statistics, but also history, like I said. Are we really sure? Anyway, I can give you another example of history, but we bring in history as well, because I think that will help to put, John A. Macdonald in context, why residential schools happened, whether abuseism for sure. But do people know that in Alberta, for example, the Stoney First Nation sued to keep the residential school open, so on and so forth. History matters because then it helps us get over our own self-righteousness. It helps us understand that other ages had tough choices as well. They weren't perfect. We're not perfect. So at Aristotle, what we're trying to do is introduce some nuance into modern day debates, question established explanations, which our scholars think are wrong, and kind of upset the apple cart in a good way that way. Because, and here's, to wrap this one up, here's why it matters. If you say racism explains all in terms of First Nations outcomes, what happens if it doesn't? And you spend all your time and money trying to combat racism, institutional racism, which again, in most parts was, done away with decades ago. Not that you can't be an individual bigot, but if you spend all your time and money on that as an explanation and trying to solve that because you think it hasn't been solved or ameliorated in large measure, then what you're not going to do is say to people like John Kretchen once did, maybe a lot of First Nations people need to move from remote reserves to the cities where you get opportunities. So if you don't deal with the core problem correctly, if your analysis is wrong, guess what? More Indigenous Canadians will live in poverty 10 years from now, 50 years from now, when you and I are pushing up daisies, or at least I am, and because I've seen this for 30 years, some conditions have improved, a lot haven't. So it's important to make the right diagnosis. And literally, that's one of the reasons I named it after Aristotle. You better take an empirical approach to some of these questions. That's also how you get to reality. You may be wrong. Maybe your analysis is flawed, but if you abandon the notion of objective reality, you know what we're back into, Ryan? Tribalism,
All right.
and magical beliefs.
So I want to dive into because there's so much to cover with the victim cult, and I wanted correct me if I'm wrong, but the core tenet of your book, I would suppose, is that grievance can become identity if allowed to become identity. Is that not to
Exactly.
make it too simple, but is that
No, exactly, and dangerously so. And in fact, I thought of First Nations chiefs. Again, I grew up in Kelowna, by the way, and
I
so
grew up in Vernon, so
oh yeah. So well, you're all familiar with a very successful First Nation, right? West Bank.
that's Kelowna. Yeah, that's right.
But I've seen over the decades a lot of First Nations chiefs and others blame again colonialism, as we've heard, everything else, residential schools, and I thought, okay, I think that's dangerous because it traps you in the past. Now, some people are victimized, and some people were victimized, in schools and elsewhere. But if you get stuck there, you may again ignore modern day reasons why a population doesn't progress. Again, if you're in the middle of northern Manitoba in a reserve that doesn't have road access, I'm expecting you to be poor, bluntly. So we better figure out what the actual problem is. But yeah, so I thought, but yeah, and then when I did more research on the victim kind of culture in various cultures around the world, from Germany in the 80s to Rwanda under the Hutus, what I found was this narrative is damnably dangerous. Germans thought they were victims of the French because they were. But when they tried to recreate their identity in the early 19th century, they got deep into cultural purity. That's back these days, right? We just need to respect indigenous culture. We need to respect X culture, Y culture, as if that will save people. No, what will save people is an education. Actually, cultural transference is a good thing, as Thomas Sowell has pointed out. You beg, borrow, and steal from other cultures. I mean, we're Europeans in look anyway. We borrowed Arab numbering, Arab numerals, right? There's no way we could have constructed a modern economy based on Roman numerals. It's a good thing we, stole those Arab numerals from Arabs and they stole it from, India originally. So cultural borrowing and interchange is a good thing. But we're back in the soup today where people think identity politics. I just want my pure cultural identity and you're culturally appropriating. I hope we culturally appropriate from each other because that's how you learn, progress. So anyway, but the victim cult is about really getting stuck in this victim narrative, including this notion of cultural purity, which the Germans were deep into long before they had the fanciful, anti-scientific, pseudoscientific notions of race purity. So what I'm trying to do with the victim cult is open up people's minds and say, be careful about getting stuck there because you're not going to learn from other cultures and you're going to blame the wrong thing for your own predicament, perhaps, without denying real victimization occurs. And at the end of the book, as you probably know, I get into some examples of where certain cultures don't get stuck or certain peoples don't get stuck in the victim narrative.
I guess for me, what's interesting is, when you look at grievance or victimhood or any number of things, it's not necessarily an either or. Like you either throw yourself into your grievance and you get trapped by it, or you work through your grievance and you're 100% okay and come out the other end.
Right.
Uh, uh, Not to get overly Catholic about it. I'm Christian, not Catholic, but that's fine. Life is a struggle and life is largely about pain. And that's just kind of the existence. Now, there are places that have had an over abundance of that pain and have had to deal with that. So is it reasonable to say that a group that has experienced longitudinally overabundance of that pain and have, for lack of a better word, been victimized, is it reasonable to understand that that may have entrenched itself in their identity and pulling them out of that may be increasingly challenging or difficult?
I think the short answer to that is yes. And I think this is where leadership matters, right? So I can't think of a more abused cohort in history than Jews.
Of course.
And yet they've had to reinvent themselves, so to speak, or relocate over time. If you went back 1,000 years and you were Jewish, you'd probably want to live in an Arab country, a Muslim country, over, say, Christian Europe at the time. And then that flipped, right, in the last 100 years. So the key thing then is really, okay, how can you, first of all, in the book, I don't go into personal examples for the most part, but you know, um, I detail, for example, the stories of East Asian Canadians and East Asian Americans and how they fought. They did fight prejudice and went to courts, tried to change the law, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. They didn't just accept their victimhood, and it was real, their victimization. And they educated their kids. They became entrepreneurial, women were allowed in some of the professions. They set the stage really for free or a flourishing, cohort, which we know today. The East Asian, examples all around us. The highest paid cohort, highest net worth cohort in the countries. Um, but so I don't deny the victimization, but the question is, okay, how can you get past it, or try and point people to potentially getting past it? Let me give you a clear example. Israel and Gazans right now. Look, I think the core problem there, yeah, of course, the Gazans are going to feel victimized, but Israel feels rightly victimized because it's been surrounded by Arab nations, some of whom attacked it in 1948, 1967, 1973. Guess what? Eventually, a good chunk of those nations now, Egypt, Jordan, others, increasingly through the Abraham Accords, have made deals with Israel because they recognized when there's their own self-interest to do so. And they got tired of fighting. Now, I would argue that the Gazans and the Palestinians are their own worst enemy, because they keep, you know, electing or allowing, and it's not difficult to get rid of guys with guns, revolutionary terrorists who don't want to do a deal. And so I place most of the blame for what's been happening in the last year and a half and even the last 30 years on Palestinian leaders from Yasser Arafat forward, precisely because, again, the victim narrative there has trapped a population and the guys with guns don't want to change the narrative. Here's a counterexample of someone who did. Jerry Adams, Sinn Féin leader, and Marty McGuinness, leader of the IRA. These guys are blowing up, although Jerry Adams claimed never to be part of the IRA. You know, terrorism against the Brits was pretty widespread, Northern Ireland and in England. But the Good Friday Accords that Adams and McGuinness agreed to, they got tired of killing Brits, more tired of killing Brits, and wanted peace. And I talk about this in the victim cult as an example. Of course, there was some wrongs done by the Brits. Certainly a lot of wrongs done by the IRA towards British people. It's not perfect when you end that and be pragmatic about trying to build a nation state. But they did, right? They came to a peace agreement and it's held. And that tells you something. That's an act of statesmanship. Even if you don't like Jerry Adams or Sinn Féin's, the IRA's Marty McGuinness. But they ended the bloodshed. I don't see that in the Palestinian leadership. And I was in the West Bank in 2005 and visited the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. And I remember, one of the diplomats there, the name will come to me, but with the Palestinian Authority, Ayab Erekat, I think his name was. I asked him, I said, look, he was complaining about the Palestinians in Israeli jails. And I said, well, look, some of these guys are scorpions, right? They're terrorists. So, and he got upset about that. I said, why would the Israelis let them out of the bottle if they're, and they have sometimes. But he said, well, we're not going to have Palestinians fight Palestinians. And I said, why not? The Americans fought each other in a civil war to decide who was going to decide on slavery. And the right side won, the North. So I don't see some cultures getting into victimhood easily. And then you have guys at the top that don't want to. If you're a Hamas commander who believes that you should introduce a theocratic state a la Iran into the land of Israel, never mind Gaza and the West Bank, you've got a problem for Israel. That, again, a long explanation, Ryan, but I think you're right that some people and cultures get stuck in victimhood. And I wouldn't say it's easy to get out of it. This is sometimes where people just move. They go, something, I'm done. Right? I want to move to the United States or Canada to go.
This is enough, and I'm going to walk away from it. I mean, you use the example in your book of Ehud Olmert's concessions to Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian
Iraq, yes. Yeah.
Iraq, sorry. And, Palestinians getting most of what they wanted. And in fact,
Right.
Israel giving away more land than it had ever offered to previously and still saying no. And to me, like, that is indicative, I think, not necessarily, it comes from a history of victimhood. However, that, in my estimation, would be the result of a decision that impacted a community by one or two people that perpetuated that victimhood throughout for whatever reason. And there's lots of reasons we can go into. I don't want to get stuck down that rabbit hole, but I think it's interesting the role of individuals in perpetuating victimhood versus the role in communities in perpetuating victimhood. And I wonder if you have any thought to examples of where you think communities may have been willing to exit that, but perhaps because of the role of individuals, they haven't been able to.
Or a positive example, Nelson Mandela, which said to Black South Africans, rightly so. He was victimized, right? He could have been better. He could have come out and been a terrorist And plenty of, post-colonial nations in Africa did exactly that. Now, unfortunately, South Africa is sliding back since Nelson Mandela died
Yeah.
some time ago, and they're dealing with the same pattern that many African nations post-colonial status have dealt with. But nonetheless, Nelson Mandela is a positive example of someone who, was it right that he was in jail? He might have been tortured, I think. No, it wasn't. Of course not. Do Black Africans always deserve equality? Of course they did. And there's only so much you can make up for the past, though. And I kind of take the view we're all settlers. Some people don't like it when I say that, but look, we all came from Africa. We're all evolutionary from Africa, evolutionary in origin from Africa. And so, colonialism and settling around the world is, immigration is a real thing, and it has been a real thing since we stood on two legs. That's never going to change. So the bigger question is, look, what kind of society do you want now? Ellis Ross wrote the foreword for my book, and I caught up with her again recently. And Ellis Ross, for those of you who may not know, some of your viewers and listeners, is of course now a politician, but he brought the Haisla First Nation on the coast of British Columbia from poverty to prosperity because he basically rejected the notion of victimhood, which is why he wrote the foreword to the victim cult. But anyway, I mean, but
A brilliant story, by the way. Like, it was absolutely brilliant.
yeah, and I'll pass a compliment on to Ellis. But, his belief is no one's going anywhere, right? You European settlers, so to speak, but even Indigenous people, of course, came across the Bering Straits 20,000 years ago. At least the ancestors of current Indigenous peoples did. So not to downgrade again the wrongs that have happened in history, but you better figure out once you're in a place with someone else if there's a better way to construct your society. And I actually think the ideas of the 19th century, the rights of the individual, treat individuals equally in law and policy, treat women equally, have an open market economy, the rule of law, property rights. This, by the way, is what was told to me in Hong Kong by business people, civil servants, politicians, to almost a person when I was there in 2013. They said, and they were worried about Beijing and what's happened in the last 12 years. They were worried about that 2013, but they said they wanted the rule of law, including the anti-corruption efforts that have been there since the 70s. They wanted capitalism. Yeah, capitalism, the rule of law, and the anti-corruption efforts. These are what make societies thrive in part. And they had that. And they were worried about Beijing taking away some of that as has happened, which speaks to me again. They had the eyeball on the future. And for the most part, they never resented the British anyway, because they had the communist example next door. So Hong Kongers, some of whom fled from China proper, before they took it over, understood that it was more important to focus on what builds, a place up, and regardless of the past. So I think that's another good example where, whether it's South Africa under Mandela and what he tried to do, the example of Hong Kong, where again, maybe we like the ideas the British brought. Didn't mean you had to be British or trading your Chinese ancestry or, your Confucian origin, your roots. You didn't have to switch religions if you didn't want to. They concentrated on things that allowed Hong Kong to flourish and wanted to keep it. That says something. But we've got a lot of people today who are like, everything's due to 2 centuries ago. Really? Are you sure about that? Modern choices don't matter? Okay.
You throughout this conversation, there's a lot of and throughout the book. I mean, the book is interesting because it's philosophy, it's history, it's there's sociology, there's so much in it. But you mention and you acknowledge that the past is important, but it can become something that holds us back, holds a people back. So for you and your studies and looking and reading and writing this book, where is that line between remembering and moving on?
Right. Well, does it benefit you personally? Does it benefit society? It's an art, more of a science. So one of the examples I give is in the late 18th century, the Quakers, who were among the first religious group to really acknowledge the evils of slavery and come to that conclusion, freed their slaves and paid them compensation. Makes sense. 1950s, Canadian governments and U.S. governments paid Japanese, Canadians and Japanese Americans in the American case, compensation for what happened during the war, the confiscation of property, the unjust imprisonment of those of Japanese ancestry. We didn't do enough, frankly, right? I mean, governments really ripped them off. And there's great prejudice in World War II against the Japanese in both countries. So I'm pretty sure we didn't do enough. And even there were some extra payments in the 90s. Again, we didn't do enough. So I think there are instances where when there's a direct cause and effect, you stole my property, government, or you stole my property, Ryan, I'm going to sue you and get it back. I mean, you want remedies in the moment, in the year. But I think the longer this has gone on, I don't think it's really reasonable or always honest for generations, three generations later, or 200 years later, to say my problems today are due to the fact that my grandfather had his property stolen. Because in fact, that's what happened to our family. My German grandparents, my grandmother emigrated from the German section of Poland after World War II, and they lost the farm, right? We could go back and claim that, My dad visited it before he passed away, as did my brother, and the occupants, and we're, I think, wondering if we were going to claim it back. We didn't want to. Why? Because my choices today, or my grandparents' choices, or my father's choices, my parents' choices, and mine, have a lot more to do with where Mark is today than what happened in Poland in the 90s, and the Germans taking the property, or is the Poles taking the property back from Germans after the war or during the war. So I think there's kind of a statute of limitations, but it's an art. It's not a science, right? There are some legitimate reasons or legitimate times to compensate people, but I think it's a bit much. For example, as Bill Clinton did, for example, to blame part of 9/11 on the Crusades 1,000 years ago. Look, Christians and Arabs, Christians and Muslims were fighting each other since the rise of Islam in the 7th century. So anyway, to blame 9/11 on an event 1,000 years ago, no, I think there's more recent cause and effect reasons for that.
I want to,
Dangerous.
sorry, go ahead.
Dangerous. It's dangerous to go too far back, and you keep the fight going, basically, right?
I want to, because you, in the book you do it, and you've done in the conversation here mentioning, the war between Israel and Gaza. And I think certainly in Canada, when a lot of us have looked at what's happened since October 7th, we've seen streets filled with mass and some very pro Hamas, others probably pro Palestinian, others probably well meaning people caught up in something for whatever reason. A lot of them very young. And so I wonder, in your estimation, young people do seem to be more prone to this kind of grievance posture, grievance thinking,
Right.
and others say they're just kind of more open to struggles, open to other people's issues, open to other people's challenges. So what's your take on that? And is openness a good thing, or is there limits to that openness?
Well, openness is a good thing, but you better figure out, if you're trying to solve a problem, again, what the core problem is. Otherwise, you're just going to keep going in circles. And there's a certain amount of pragmatism when it comes to international relations, for example. So again, as we discussed, I think the core problem is not Israel. I think it's Hamas, funded by Iran, Hezbollah, the same thing. Iran's a theocratic state, which wants a Muslim caliphate, like, to be blunt about it. That's what they've got. That's what they want. They don't believe in equal rights for women, to the degree we do in the West. And there's plenty of ex-Iranians, Iranian expats and young Iranians who think as you and I do, like the Iranian theocracy is a problem. And you've got that in Hamas, you've got that in Hezbollah, you've got it in the Houthis. So to me, it's about making a judgment call, doing an analysis of the situation about what's the core problem. And so as we discussed, I think it's been Palestinian leaders, the guys with guns who don't want to do a deal, unlike Jerry Adams and Marty McGuinness, who did do a deal with Great Britain on Northern Ireland and were pragmatic and wanted to build a state more than they wanted to kill Brits. So, because you've got Hamas and Hezbollah that want to kill Israelis more than they want to have an actual Palestinian state, which they could have had in coexistence with Israel. So to me, I think it's just about, are you doing a proper analysis of the situation? Now, again, that's art sometimes. It's not exact science, but I think it requires analysis. It requires an understanding of history. It requires understanding that Israel has done peace deals, understanding that land for peace, Israel gave back the Sinai 3 times the size of Israel to Egypt. Didn't have to, you know, but it did as part of the peace deal with Egypt. So you look at certain behaviors and, it's kind of like the person who's, a victim. And guess what? They're a victim of everyone, right? Everyone's the problem, but not
Yeah,
them.
everyone's a problem but themselves. Yeah, you know that everyone has someone like that in their life.
So the personal is a good example of, the corporate in this case. It's the same thing. Like, if it's a person, if a problem with everyone else, maybe the problem is the person. Same thing with, I think the Palestinian leadership and the Gazans. And again, I have some sympathy. You should be open-minded to people. I mean, like, I have sympathy for Gazans that have died in the war with Israel. I just blame Hamas for starting that war. What's Israel supposed to do? Lie over and allow a second Holocaust, which Hamas would have enacted on 10 million Israelis, including 2 million Muslims, 2 million Arabs. So, but again, that's a bit of an art and science. And I think it requires patience. It requires some nuance. I think today, part of it, Ryan, is that also grievances can last a lot longer. Think about a pre-internet age. Well, let's go back 100 years. You had a newspaper, magazines. Later in the 1920s or 30s, you get radio. Later on, television, even television. Before the internet, I mean, things would not be at the top of the news forever unless there's a reason for them to be at the top of the news forever. But these days, you can create a grievance online. You can bring something out of the past from the Crusades in 1000, or if you want to take the other side, when Muslims conquered whatever it was in, what we now call France, sometime in the 800s. I mean, you could take that, you could bang on it to death and make a grievance out of it and get people's emotions stirred up because you can see it in real time. You can create videos about these things, right?
And if I can, it's this. it's easier to make money off that stuff now than it's ever been. There's more access to more on their wallet.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. But there's also, I think people are sincere, but the problem is they can't put it in historical context like we just did. I think we did properly on Israel and Gaza and the leaders in Hamas, or, Great Britain versus Northern Ireland and Marty McGuinness and Tony Blair and Sinn Féin's Jerry Adams. Once you understand some context and that, getting over the troubles, then maybe, but I don't think a lot of people have patience for that. Of course, people respond immediately to the image. So let me give you this another way to look at it. You may remember or know of, he's passed away now, but there was a New York fellow at New York University, and he wrote a book called on childhood, but also television. Neil Postman, and he wrote a couple of books. Again, one on childhood, one on television. But his basic thesis in both of them was that the rise of television damaged literacy. And he said before 1950, the apogee of literacy, at least in the West, in English-speaking countries, was between 1850 and 1950 and the rise of universal education. What this did is it forced you to reason because you had to sit down at a desk as a kid. You were taught to read from left to right, to think through things. You had to reason your way through things. Otherwise you couldn't get up from your seat. Also, it created childhood, was his point, because adults could hide stuff from kids, just small people. It created the notion of childhood. But the rise of television really harmed, the notion of harmed children in this sense, that you can no longer keep secrets from children because they can watch something horrific on TV or in videos when I grew up.
Hmm.
And it's been exacerbated with the internet. But what it did to literacy is we're back in the cave. We're watching images on Plato's cave. And what do images do? They get your emotions going, but they don't necessarily lead you. They don't make you reason, right? Because your mind doesn't argue with an image. It accepts it as real. It could be fake, right? So when somebody can make a fake image online, not portray the whole the totality of what's happening in Gaza and the origins of it, the attack on October the 7th and before that, the deal that Yasser Arafat turned down, that takes patience, it takes reason. But if all you see is the image in the moment and you look at Gaza and you see that's horrible what happened to children. Yes, it is. It's also horrible what happened on October the 7th to children.
Mhm.
And now again, can we get to the core problem here? So I think the rise of the internet has allowed a lot of grievance narratives to just go viral, right? To metastasize. And I mean, the internet has some very good things. You and I are talking, and we wouldn't have been able to do this 30 years ago. You wouldn't have been able to set up your own podcast without hundreds of thousands of dollars, right?
For sure.
Find a network that employs you. So there's good things about the internet, but the bad thing is these grievance narratives just get out there and they stay there. And how do you and I? Nobody can be an expert in everything. How do you parse through the nonsense out there, the wrong kind of context, the mis stuff, the outright factual, the actual lies. So it's not easy, right? But again, that's back to why I started Aristotle. In part, we're trying to use history and we use videos and we're trying to teach people as best we can, responsibly as we can, to kind of say, have you considered this about issue X? Have you considered that maybe the Palestinians' leadership is wrong, and here's why. Have you considered that maybe, we did try and address systemic racism back in the 1950s? Maybe something else explains lower than average indigenous incomes in 2025. So I think by raising these questions, we can make some progress. But it's easy to be tribal, in the internet. And images on Plato's wall on the wall in Plato's Republic, that the story of the wall, we're all looking at the wall and images and we think the images are real. They certainly get your emotions up, right?
Well, as people, we love to be with a group, and not only with a group, but a group that endorses our thinking, and that if ever we stray, the group will try to pull us back.
Right. Which is why it's important to unite around good ideas,
Yes.
concepts as opposed to bad. I mean, I've given up the notion that people will, can reasoned out of their tribal nature. I think we're all going to be tribal, and it's maybe our first instinct, and it's a self-preservation instinct, maybe. And it makes sense also. You can't love 7 billion people, 8 billion people around the world, but you can love seven.
Well, that's very interesting because, and I think that's what drew me so much to not just Aristotle, but your work, because I was in that tribal space for so long, and I extricated myself from it because number one, I saw what it was doing to me in my own mindset, but I also saw that I was not growing in that group. There was no growth opportunities for me there. So I extricated myself and left, and then tried to find a different group. And now I'm in a different group. But I think the thing that I
It's tribal, but good ideas are good things, right?
yes,
They think to be tribal about,
right.
massacring Jews, or Marxism in the 20th century, destructive economic ideology. It's another thing to be, tribal about, the great ideas of individual rights and law and policy, the rights of women, free societies. That's something I think positively to unite around.
But those are, Enlightenment principles once again, reasoned, sound
Yeah.
principles.
Yeah.
We are at the end of our conversation. We were going to go 30. We went 45. That's fantastic. Thank you for your time. Before we go, I want to do a quick lightning round with you. So I did not give you these questions beforehand. I'm looking for your kind of immediate impulse, your instinct to get some feedback from you, so we can learn a little bit more about you. So, victim cult in one word.
One word. Oh my goodness. The victim cult in one word. Grievances.
Grievances. Perfect. What book or thinker has most changed your worldview? I think I know the answer to this, but
Thomas Sowell.
Thomas Sowell. I was gonna say either Aristotle or Thomas Sowell. Is there a time you changed your mind on something big? What caused it?
Sure. Look, I mean, I would have had more fundamentalist beliefs growing up. Um, and so I just changed some views on things like evolution. I mean, I just think like evolution is how we got here. I like the Christian narrative, like the Genesis story, but I don't take it literally. So, I mean, that's pretty big for at least people who grew up in that tradition, right? Evangelical tradition. And you can be a Christian and believe in evolution, or a Catholic and believe in evolution. Catholics are a Christian, of course, but again, in the evangelical circles, I made those distinctions growing up. But so I think that's one example. There have been some other things, but look, I was probably always more analytical. I was as a kid. So, and I read a lot of history. So, I mean, I encountered Thomas Sowell later when I think about it, but I mean, there's been other thinkers before then. Um, even there's a long passed away Christian philosopher named Francis Schaeffer who actually made me think about art and culture. That was probably more influential because it got me thinking, even though it couldn't be known outside of Christian circles. For me, that was very influential. And his son, Frankie Schaeffer, who wrote a book about art, which I really appreciated. I'm trying to think of other early books I read, but, encountering William F. Buckley's National Review, which had great wit, but also, I thought had decent analysis about, again, the Cold War and other. So even though I've done lots of economic stuff in my career, I really at heart interested in history and philosophy, and again, the good life, right? How we got here. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's lots of influences. Paul Johnson on intellectuals and history. But I mean, there's a lot of historians I could probably quote that I think have, broadened my thinking or deepened my thinking, or, reassured me that, yeah, your suspicion on issue X was right.
Two final questions. What trait do you admire most in people who have overcome real hardship?
Gratefulness. I mean, yeah, grateful.
Gratitude is a big part of your book, by the way. Like, I think if someone reads your book and reads the words on the page and tries not to take anything else from it, they'll get what's here and it's good. But I think gratitude is a strong theme that underpins a lot of your book.
Yeah, not becoming bitter. I mean, look, I know people that could have become bitter, relatives who, my mother had some very tough times and, was sweet to the end of her life and had reasons not to be. And you look at that, right, and the kindness. It amazes me that actually people that go through some very tough circumstances can come out at the other end still kind, still and have great gratefulness, for their life. And that's huge because I'm not sure if I'd gone through what some people have gone through that I would as would be able to do that, right? And so I admire that, people who you just think, how did you survive that? And maybe it's a testament to the human spirit, but there's something to that, right? It's kind of amazing that you just have to sit back and look at it and go, wow,
Something
how,
remarkable.
how did you do that? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know how people survive some of the things people survive.
There's something remarkable about the human ability to be resilient, which I think is magnificent in and of itself. Final question. What gives you genuine hope right now?
The morning sunrise.
That's
In my house, I've got a great, got lots of big windows, and in the morning, I get the sun coming up in one of them. So I sit there with my coffee before I get into my day, and it's like, yeah, I need this sunshine, and I like spring. They both kind of go together in my view. So this is my favorite time of year, and when the sun's up at 7 a.m. through my window, I'm just kind of taking it in. There's something about that, sunshine is just, it's a good thing.
back to nature, which is not always a bad thing. Mark Milke, thank you so much for spending time with me to talk about your book, The Victim Cult, to talk about the Aristotle Foundation, to go a little bit deeper on some of these key philosophical societal questions. I really appreciated it. Did you have any final thoughts for my listeners and viewers before we let you go?
Well, only that, the victim cult and the Aristotle Foundation. You can find us at aristotlefoundation.org. But let me leave you with something from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, which I thought was, it's a bit sobering, but there's certainly a silver lining to it. People will blame others, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn talks about this. He was in the Soviet labor camps, as you probably know. Got there because he made a joke about Joseph Stalin, ended up in a labor camp, in Siberia in the gulags, and moved away from his Marxist views at that point. But he noticed others would blame people and say, if only we got rid of group X, then we would be a perfect world, a better world. And he's like, they misunderstood. He said the dividing line, and he said the dividing line between good and evil is not between people, certain groups. He said the dividing line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And I thought that was profoundly wise, because we're all potentially capable of great evil, and hopefully also of great good. And so when you recognize that, then hopefully you check yourself, but you don't accept much romanticization about yourself or others. And then you can do some great good if you can come to that understanding. At least I hope we can.
Mark Milke, Aristotle Foundation, thank you again so much for your time. I hope we can have you back to have more of these great conversations, because this was fantastic. I feel like I already learned a whole bunch in 45 minutes. So thank you.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to, Ron.
Thank you.